The rain had softened to a mist over the palace courtyard when Royal Guard Thomas Calder completed his early morning sweep. His boots pressed faint echoes into the wet stone, and the familiar rhythm grounded him in a tradition passed through 3 generations of guards before him. The palace gates, the bronze lions, the rows of historic elms. Thomas knew every line and shadow by heart. He had grown up hearing stories of how his grandfather once stood outside Windsor during the Queen's winter retreats, how his father guarded the long corridor leading to Princess Anne's private study. But Thomas's own post carried a deeper weight, for he had been assigned to the younger royals, especially Princess Charlotte. The palace called it a routine duty, but Thomas felt something different, something almost sacred, whenever he walked the perimeter of the children's wing. He noticed the little things: the white curtains Charlotte preferred half open, the soft clicking of her small keyboard when she practiced, the way her laughter carried down the hallway like warm light. And though mornings were usually calm, this morning felt unsettled, as if the mist itself carried a warning he couldn't yet name. The radio on his shoulder crackled softly, then fell silent again, leaving only the quiet shuffle of guards changing shifts. Thomas tightened his gloves, turned toward the motor court, and continued his patrol with a steady, purposeful pace. Thomas reached the Royal Motor Court just as a line of cars was being prepped for the day's private movements. Drivers in dark coats moved briskly, checking tires and mirrors, opening doors, adjusting seats. It was a routine scene, orderly, calm, predictable in the way palace operations always strove to be. But Thomas felt an unfamiliar tug of unease. He scanned the vehicles out of habit, his eyes lingering on a black sedan positioned near the far archway. Nothing appeared unusual, yet something about the way it sat, slightly turned, as if hastily parked, caught his attention. He paused, letting the air settle, listening. The faint tapping of raindrops on the car roof mingled with the muted shuffle of staff heading toward the service doors. A stable groom hurried past with a bundle of documents tucked under his arm. A footman whispered something to another, their voices too low to carry meaning. Everything seemed normal, yet the unease stayed. Thomas inhaled the damp air, letting the familiar scent of wet stone and engine oil steady him. He reminded himself that morning jitters sometimes came from nowhere at all. Still, his gaze drifted once more toward the black sedan before he resumed walking, his senses sharper now, alert for the slightest shift in the palace's quiet rhythm. As Thomas approached the east entrance, he noticed a small group of staff emerging from the corridor leading toward the royal schoolroom. A governess clutched a set of lesson books to her chest, while a young footman tried to balance a tray of breakfast dishes. Their hurried steps echoed with a faint urgency, though neither seemed distressed. Thomas offered a polite nod, and the governess returned it with a brief, weary smile. She often appeared tired after early lessons with the children, but today her eyes flicked toward the courtyard behind him, as if checking to ensure something or someone was exactly where it should be. Thomas followed her glance, scanning the misty space once more. The cars remained lined in their precise rows. The stable groom disappeared behind a pillar. A guard on the far wall stood perfectly still, nothing out of place. Yet the unsettled feeling sharpened again, threading through his spine. He continued walking, adjusting the radio at his shoulder, but the governess's anxious glance lingered with him, weaving itself into the morning's quiet tension. When Thomas reached the sheltered alcove beside the archway, he paused for a moment of stillness. The palace often behaved like a living thing, breathing, shifting, holding its secrets behind layers of protocol and polished stone. Guards learned to sense its moods. Today it felt watchful. From where he stood, Thomas could see the children's wing windows, their pale glow suggesting someone had already opened the curtains inside. Perhaps Princess Charlotte was finishing breakfast. Perhaps she was preparing for an outing, one of those discreet, unannounced departures the royals sometimes made to avoid crowds. Thomas considered this possibility as a gust of wind carried the faintest sound from across the motor court. He narrowed his eyes. It was soft, too soft to identify. A breath, a stir, something close to a muffled sob. His pulse tightened. He turned his head slowly toward the black sedan. The windows were tinted, and the door handles glistened with rain. The soft sound did not repeat, leaving him unsure if he had imagined it. Yet the memory of it hung in the air, fragile and trembling. Thomas stepped forward, just slightly, just enough to shift his weight toward the vehicle, though not yet enough to justify abandoning his post. Another guard, Andrew Marks, emerged from behind a pillar and approached at a relaxed pace. Thomas straightened slightly, masking his tension beneath routine formality. Andrew, older and more seasoned, carried himself with the casual confidence of someone who had served long enough to read trouble long before it appeared. He greeted Thomas with a quiet nod. "Quiet morning," he said. Thomas nodded in return, eyes flicking again toward the sedan. Andrew followed his line of sight. "Something wrong?" Thomas hesitated, weighing whether to voice his unease without evidence. "Not sure," he said finally. "Thought I heard something." Andrew scanned the row of vehicles but shrugged gently. "Probably staff moving equipment. It's early." Thomas wanted to agree, to let the moment dissolve into routine. But the air felt too heavy, the mist too watchful. Still, he offered no further comment. Andrew gave him one last assessing glance, then walked on, leaving Thomas alone with the quiet pulse of uncertainty. A few minutes passed, each second stretching longer as Thomas resumed his patrol, though his mind remained anchored to the sedan. The driver assigned to it had not yet appeared, which was uncommon this close to departure times. Thomas slowed his pace again, listening. A faint sound whispered from the vehicle, a soft, quivering breath. Unmistakable this time. His heart thudded, instinct rising. But he held position. Guards were trained to observe before acting, to confirm before intervening. He focused, tuning out the distant chatter of staff. There it was again. A small, stifled sniffle, the kind a frightened child makes when trying not to cry. Thomas's throat tightened. He took one deliberate step toward the vehicle, then another, the mist curling around his boots. Something was inside that car. Something or someone trying not to be heard. Thomas reached the front of the sedan, placing one gloved hand lightly on the damp hood. He leaned closer, angling his ear toward the rear door. The tinted window revealed nothing. But the sound came again. Clearer now, the unmistakable tremble of a child trying not to sob. Thomas's breath halted. He knew that sound. He had heard it once before when Princess Charlotte had scraped her knee during a garden play session. He would never forget it. And now, hearing it again, muffled inside a locked, unattended car, the unease surged into something sharper, something urgent. The air thickened as if holding its breath alongside him, and in that suspended moment, Thomas realized the calm morning had already shattered, even before the palace knew it. Thomas stepped back from the sedan, forcing himself to breathe steadily as the mist tightened around the motor court like a thin, restless veil. He scanned the surrounding area for movement, noting the drivers conferring near the opposite archway and a pair of footmen carrying folded blankets toward the service door. None of them looked toward the black sedan, and none appeared aware that something trembled inside it. Thomas's pulse stayed high, but discipline held him still, reminding him that acting too quickly without context could jeopardize the chain of command. Yet the soft, broken sound he had heard, fragile, unmistakably frightened, echoed through his mind with increasing urgency. He moved closer once more, this time stopping only a foot from the rear door, positioning himself so the mist shielded his posture from distant staff. He listened again, eyes narrowed, jaw set with the quiet tension of a man trained never to ignore the smallest anomaly. A faint shift brushed the interior of the car, followed by a quick, trembling inhale that pierced the silence like a needle. Thomas's heart clenched, and he leaned in until his ear hovered near the tinted glass. Then, at last, a whisper of a voice, soft, uneven, unmistakably that of a child. "Please." A fragile plea, barely audible yet full of fear. Thomas froze, every instinct roaring that something was terribly wrong, that a member of the royal family, perhaps Princess Charlotte herself, was inside that locked car without supervision. He glanced toward the staff again, searching for the assigned driver or any sign that this vehicle was scheduled for imminent departure. But no one approached. A sense of gathering unease thickened the air, wrapping around Thomas like a tightening band, urging him to act but warning him to do so with caution. He stepped back and activated his radio, speaking low to maintain the appearance of normal routine. "Calder reporting," he said. "Unscheduled activity near vehicle row 3. requesting confirmation of assignments. The radio responded with static, then a brief acknowledgement that someone would check the schedule. Though no urgency colored the reply, Thomas lowered the radio, his jaw tightening as he looked once more at the black sedan. The rain misted lightly across its surface, blurring the reflection of the high stone walls behind him. Inside, something shifted small, hesitant, accompanied by a faint, choked sob that pierced him with chilling certainty. He leaned closer, lowering his voice to a near whisper, though he knew the child inside likely couldn't hear him through the thick doors. "It's all right," he murmured, hoping tone alone might carry through. "I'm here." Another sob answered sharper this time, trembling, unmistakably filled with panic, and Thomas's breath caught. He stepped back, assessing the scene with the precision his training demanded, noting every figure in the courtyard, every window overlooking the area, every possible witness or threat. A movement at the far entrance drew his gaze as Princess Anne emerged, her stride brisk, her expression as sharp and assessing as ever. She spoke with a senior advisor, her gestures short and clipped, suggesting a conversation that carried weight. Thomas hesitated. If he approached her now without certainty, he risked escalating something that might yet have an innocent explanation. But another broken, stifled cry seeped from the sedan, so faint it might have been lost if Thomas hadn't been standing inches from the door. His pulse hammered as the sound burrowed into him, tearing away any lingering doubt. He took a slow breath, knowing the protocol. Guards were permitted to intervene when a royal minor was in visible or audible distress, even if confirmation had not yet reached the chain of command. And though he could not yet see her, the voice inside that car left no doubt. A shadow moved inside the courtyard as Andrew Marks returned, glancing toward Thomas with a questioning look that bordered on concern. "Still hearing it?" he asked quietly. Thomas nodded, the movement tight and controlled, his eyes fixed on the trembling silhouette, barely visible through the tinted rear window. Andrew stepped closer, listening with the trained stillness of someone who had handled crises before, though this moment carried a different weight, a more personal one. There came another small gasp from inside, higher pitched, unmistakable now as a young girl's voice fighting tears. Andrew's eyes widened. "That's her," Thomas whispered. He didn't need to say the name. They both recognized Princess Charlotte's voice, fragile and frightened in a way neither had ever heard before. "We need confirmation," Andrew murmured, though uncertainty flickered in his usually steady tone. Before Thomas could reply, the child inside let out a small, desperate whimper that cut cleanly through the courtyard's calm. That was the moment the tension shattered. Thomas stepped forward decisively, his gloved hand closing around the rear door handle as instinct and duty collided in a single, unshakable command. Andrew positioned himself beside him, forming a protective barrier around the vehicle as the courtyard bustle carried on unaware. Thomas leaned close to the window, his voice firm but gentle. "Princess Charlotte, this is Guard Calder," he said quietly. "You're safe, I promise you." A small, trembling sound answered, the kind that shattered any hesitation remaining in him. Thomas glanced once toward the palace windows, once toward the gates, then steeled himself as the mist swirled in a cold spiral around his feet. He tightened his grip on the handle, every second stretching into a silent vow. Whatever waited inside that car, whatever had caused the princess to cry alone in the dark interior, he would face it without hesitation. And with Andrew bracing beside him, Thomas pulled. The door resisted at first, locked or jammed, but the unmistakable sound of Charlotte's frightened breathing from inside fueled Thomas's strength as he braced his boots against the wet stone. He pulled harder, mist swirling around him as the courtyard seemed to fall into stillness, every witness unaware that the next moment would shatter the calm in a way none of them could have imagined. The door gave way with a sharp metallic jolt, and the moment it swung open, Thomas's breath stopped. Princess Charlotte sat curled in the corner of the rear seat, her small hands trembling against her cheeks, her eyes red and swollen as though she had been crying for far longer than the few minutes he had heard. Her school jumper was slightly rumpled, and her hair always neatly brushed before outings hung unevenly over her shoulder. She looked up at Thomas with a mixture of relief and lingering fear, the kind that cuts straight through training and protocol. Thomas crouched immediately, softening his posture, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's all right, ma'am. You're safe now." Charlotte blinked through her tears, trying to steady her breath, but another small sob escaped. Andrew stepped behind Thomas, shielding the open doorway from view of staff who might pass through the courtyard. "Princess," he said gently, "may we ask what happened? Did someone lock you inside?" Charlotte shook her head quickly at first, then hesitated, as though uncertain whether to speak or afraid of saying the wrong thing. Thomas noticed the faint scrape on the seat beside her, as if she had tried to claw at the upholstery in her distress. He reached for her hand, offering the steady warmth of his glove. "You're all right," he said again, anchoring her with calm authority. "Just tell us what you remember." Before she could answer, hurried footsteps echoed across the motor court. Thomas stiffened instinctively, rising halfway while keeping his body angled protectively between Charlotte and the approaching figure. A driver jogged toward them, Grant Huxley, one of the newer hires, known for his eagerness but not yet seasoned in handling the royal children. His expression carried both alarm and confusion. "What are you doing with that door?" he demanded, stopping short when he saw Charlotte inside. "Wait, how did she get there? I was told—" Thomas's eyes narrowed. "Who instructed you regarding this vehicle?" he asked. Grant swallowed hard, his face pale. I was told the car needed to be brought forward for a security test. I didn't know anyone was inside. I swear I didn't." Andrew stepped closer, towering slightly over the young driver. "Who told you?" he pressed. "Name." Grant shifted anxiously, glancing around as though seeking an escape route. I'm not sure, sir. I just received the directive." Thomas exchanged a sharp look with Andrew. A directive without a source was not just irregular, it was a breach. Charlotte's small voice trembled behind him. "He wasn't the one," she whispered. Thomas turned back, crouching once more to meet her eyes. "Princess," he said softly, "you're safe. You can tell me anything." She looked toward the opposite door, her breath catching. It wasn't him. Someone else closed the door. Someone I didn't know. A cold current sliced through Thomas's chest. "Someone outside the family?" he asked carefully. She shook her head. "No. Someone inside." The courtyard seemed to still all at once, the mist pausing in its slow drift as if the palace itself was holding its breath. "Do you remember who?" Andrew asked quietly. Charlotte hesitated, then nodded. "I think it was Lady Victoria." Thomas felt the impact of those words, like a jolt. Lady Victoria, Princess Beatrice's new advisor, recently brought into the inner household as a liaison for charitable engagements. A woman with perfect posture, unreadable eyes, and a reputation for pushing her influence faster than palace tradition tolerated. She had arrived with polite smiles and polished credentials, but Thomas had sensed just once, in a private hallway, that her eyes lingered too critically on the young royals. Still, locking Princess Charlotte inside a car? That crossed into something darker, something far beyond ambition. As Charlotte shivered, Thomas removed his glove and placed his warm hand over hers. "You did the right thing telling us," he said gently. But beneath his calm tone, tension surged. Why would Lady Victoria trap the princess inside a vehicle? What did she hope to accomplish? Thomas rose to his full height, a protective force solidifying in his stance. "We need to move her," Andrew murmured. "Get her inside, away from the courtyard." Thomas nodded. He extended his arms, and Charlotte reached for him instinctively, clinging tightly as he lifted her from the car. The moment she wrapped her arms around his neck, something fierce and immovable settled into his chest. He would not allow her to be frightened again. As Thomas carried Charlotte toward the nearest entrance, the palace seemed to shift around them. Staff paused, heads turning, expressions questioning, but uncertain whether they should approach. Thomas issued firm, quiet commands to the nearest footmen. "Clear the corridor ahead. No one enters without clearance." His voice left no room for hesitation. Andrew stayed behind to secure the car, question Grant further, and ensure no evidence was disturbed. Inside the corridor, the light was warm, but the air felt tense. Thomas kept walking, adjusting Charlotte's weight slightly to soothe her trembling. She pressed her face against his shoulder, breathing unevenly. "She closed the door," Charlotte whispered, voice fragile. "She said she needed a moment alone with me. I didn't understand." Thomas's jaw set. "Did she say anything else?" Charlotte nodded faintly. "She said She said people don't appreciate what she does, and that someday the family would need her more than they know. Then she told me to stay quiet and wait. A chill threaded through Thomas's spine. Those words carried the cadence of threat, cloaked in grievance. Near the staircase, Princess Anne appeared, her expression sharpening the moment she spotted Charlotte in Thomas's arms. "What happened?" she demanded. Thomas stopped, bowed his head briefly, and spoke low. "Your Royal Highness, Princess Charlotte was found locked inside an unattended vehicle. She was in distress." Anne's eyes flashed with protective fury. "Locked? By whom?" Thomas hesitated only a moment. She identified Lady Victoria. Anne inhaled sharply, her composure turning razor-edged. "Bring her to the sitting room, now, and no one enters or leaves that wing until I say so." Thomas obeyed, carrying Charlotte deeper into the palace, feeling the storm beginning to stir behind the walls. Guards were moving, staff were whispering, and somewhere within the sprawling corridors, Lady Victoria, calm, polished, calculating, was likely continuing her morning routine as though nothing were amiss. Charlotte tightened her arms around his neck. "She's angry now," she whispered. Thomas kept his voice steady. "She won't come near you again, I promise." But even as he said it, he knew this incident was only the beginning. A threat had entered the palace, not loud, not obvious, but deliberate and close enough to touch the heart of the royal family. And the moment Charlotte's quiet accusation reached the king, the palace would tremble with consequences no one could yet predict. For now, Thomas focused on the child in his arms, guiding her to safety as the weight of what he had uncovered settled heavily on his shoulders. A truth had been exposed, a truth Lady Victoria had not intended anyone to hear, and the confrontation that would follow would shake the palace from its foundations. Princess Anne led the way through the cream-colored corridor, her footsteps sharp and deliberate, echoing off the marble tiles with the unmistakable cadence of impending reckoning. Thomas followed closely behind, still carrying Princess Charlotte, who clung to him with small, trembling hands. The palace walls, usually serene with morning calm, felt charged now, tense with shifting undercurrents. Guards positioned at each corner straightened as Anne swept past them, her expression a fiercely controlled mask. She did not raise her voice, did not display outward panic, but every guard who saw her recognized the signs. Something had gone wrong, terribly wrong. In the private sitting room, Anne motioned for Thomas to set Charlotte on the wide upholstered sofa. He did so gently, kneeling beside her for a moment, until she released her grip on his collar. Her eyes were still damp, but she breathed more evenly now, drawing steadiness from his presence. Anne knelt before the princess, brushing a hand through her hair. "You're safe here," she said. "Everything else will be handled." Charlotte nodded softly, though the unease in her eyes lingered. Thomas stepped back only as far as protocol required, standing near the doorway in case Charlotte needed him again. Outside, hushed footsteps approached, the kind that signaled news spreading rapidly, staff repositioning themselves, guards communicating quietly through radios and coded signals. A storm was brewing across the palace grounds, and at its center stood one name whispered with growing alarm: Lady Victoria. The door opened with a soft click, and King Charles entered, his face drawn with concern rather than fury. His presence changed the air in the room. Tension sharpened but steadied. He looked first at Charlotte, then at Thomas, silently demanding the truth. Anne rose, her voice crisp but trembling at the edges. "She was locked in a car alone, frightened." Charles inhaled sharply. "Who did this?" Anne did not hesitate. She identified Lady Victoria. The king's calm fractured for the briefest moment. His jaw tightened, eyes narrowing with a restrained anger Thomas had rarely seen in him. "Where is she now?" he asked. A guard just outside the door answered. "Still in the West Wing, Your Majesty, preparing for her scheduled briefing." The king gave a slow nod, his expression turning resolute. "Bring her." As the guard hurried away, the room seemed to hold its breath. Charlotte shifted nervously, and Thomas lowered his gaze to her with quiet reassurance. "You're protected, ma'am," he said gently. She leaned against Anne, but her small hand reached subtly toward Thomas, as if grounding herself between the two figures she trusted most in that moment. Minutes stretched with tense stillness until the door finally opened again. Lady Victoria entered with careful poise, her chin lifted, her posture impeccable. She looked around the room with a calm, composed curiosity, though a flicker of confusion crossed her face when she saw both the king and Princess Charlotte. "Your Majesty," she said smoothly, offering a small bow. "I was told you needed to see me at once." Charles stared at her with a level, cold intensity. "I do," he replied. "We have a matter to discuss, one that concerns my granddaughter." Lady Victoria's gaze drifted to Charlotte, who stiffened at the sight of her. Thomas noticed the faint tremor in the child's shoulders, the way her breath seemed to catch even before she spoke. Before the king could continue, Charlotte's small voice broke through in a whisper. It was her. Victoria blinked, a slow, deliberate gesture. "I beg your pardon?" The words came out too controlled, too measured. Anne stepped forward, posture rigid. "Charlotte was found locked in a vehicle, terrified. She says you closed the door on her." Victoria's eyes widened, not with guilt, Thomas sensed, but with a subtle, calculating alarm. "That is absurd," she said. "I have been preparing for my briefing all morning. I never went near the motor court." Charlotte shook her head quickly. "You did," she whispered. "You told me to wait. You said it wouldn't be long." Victoria's lips parted, but no words came. For the first time, her perfect composure wavered. Something in her eyes, too quick to hide, revealed a flash of anger. Thomas caught it. Anne caught it. And the king certainly caught it. Charles stepped forward. "My granddaughter has no reason to lie," he said, voice tight with steel. "Explain yourself." Victoria swallowed, struggling to regain her crafted exterior. "Your Majesty, there must be a misunderstanding. Perhaps she saw someone else, someone in similar attire." But Charlotte spoke again, more firmly now. "You said people don't appreciate you. You said someday the family would need you more than they know. Then you shut the door." Silence crashed over the room. Thomas watched Lady Victoria closely. A guard learned to observe the smallest details, the twitch of a jaw, the shift in breath, the tilt of a shoulder under pressure. Victoria's shoulders tightened, then loosened, subtle but unmistakable. It was the posture of someone cornered, calculating escape routes rather than innocence. The king straightened, regality turning resolute. "Guards," he said, his voice carrying the weight of final judgment. Two guards entered immediately, stepping behind Victoria. Her composure snapped just slightly, a crack in the surface. "Is this truly necessary?" she insisted. "This child is frightened, surely mistaken." But Thomas stepped forward then, his voice calm but unyielding. "Princess Charlotte's clothing bears fibers from the rear seat of the vehicle, and she responded to my voice through the door." Victoria turned to him sharply. For the first time, her words came with a hiss of frustration. "You overstepped your authority, guard." Thomas did not flinch. "My authority exists to protect her." Anne's voice cut in like a blade. "Remove her from the palace, effective immediately." Victoria's breath hitched. Her eyes darted between them all. Thomas, Anne, the king, the trembling child on the sofa. Whatever ambition had fueled her, whatever games she had intended to play, had collapsed beneath the weight of a frightened princess's testimony and the unwavering loyalty of a guard who refused to ignore a child's tears. The guards took her by the arms, not forcefully, but firmly. She did not resist, though fury simmered beneath her controlled expression. "This is a mistake," she said coldly. "One you will regret." The king's tone turned glacial. "The only mistake here was trusting you." The door closed behind her with a heavy, echoing finality. The tension in the room loosened, but the air did not yet clear. Charlotte exhaled shakily. Thomas knelt beside her again, offering the steadying presence she'd clung to earlier. "You did very well, ma'am," he said gently. "You were brave." She touched his sleeve, her voice small. "You heard me." He nodded. "Every sound." Princess Anne placed a hand on his shoulder. "Your instincts saved her," she said quietly. Thomas bowed his head. "I only did my duty, ma'am." The king approached then, his expression carrying both gratitude and gravity. "Your duty," he said, "protected my granddaughter when she could not protect herself. Outside the windows, The mist finally began to lift, but inside the palace, whispers were already spreading, whispers of the guard who forced open a car door, of the princess found crying inside, of the advisor removed under the king's command. And though the immediate threat had passed, the lingering question remained like a faint echo through the corridors. If Lady Victoria had been bold enough to attempt this, what had she planned next? For now, Princess Charlotte was safe. And Thomas Calder's quiet, unwavering loyalty had shifted the palace once again.